Welcome to Learn Payments channel. In this video, we will look at India's NCMC, that is National Common Mobility Card. In this type of cards, the payment and the transit cards coexist together in the same plastic. We will look at a quick background on these type of cards. We will understand the ecosystem, what type of cards are these, how the data of the payments and also the transport authorities coexist in the same plastic, what is the card issuance process, and what is the overall AFC ecosystem. AFC here means automated fare collection process, and we will also look at the important messages that are very specific to these type of cards. Let's look at a quick background. We all know about the payment cards. These payment cards are purely used for payments that could be done at POS terminals or ATMs or e-commerce. It could be debit, credit, or prepaid cards. We would also have come across these travel cards whenever we have taken a metro or if we have taken a bus rides. There are passes that are issued that can be used only within that transport system. Like for example, if I take a Delhi metro card, the card is only valid within the Delhi metros. So these are different types of plastics and each of them have their own purpose. And I'm sure we had scenarios where our wallet was filled of multiple types of cards pertaining to the transit cards and also different payment cards. So what NCMC aims to do here is to bring all of these plastics into one single card where the payment cards and also these transit cards coexist in the same plastic itself. How is it possible? Because transit cards and the payment cards fundamentally use the same protocols, which is ISO 14443 for contactless. And we all know that payment cards also have the contactless capability, which have been issued in the last few years. So NCMC puts all of them into the same plastic. Is this something new that we are doing in India? Not really. The payment and transit cards have been implemented in other countries like Oyster in London, Singapore Easy Card, and Opal Sydney cards in Hong Kong as well. So this has been implemented in other countries. But what we are trying to do different is extend this transit segment into not just transport cards, but we would like to extend these NCMC cards into parking or toll or in retail stores, etc. So we are creating a common protocol where a transit card can be extended to various other scenarios. So what type of cards are NCMC, right? So NCMC has an open loop payment card, which is a standard prepaid debit and credit card that we see. Along with that, it also has a stored value wallet, which is used only at select merchant locations. Like for example, it could be used in specific metros or in specific parking facilities, etc. Now let's look at the overall ecosystem. This payment ecosystem is something that we are usually familiar with, where there is an acquirer bank which controls the POS terminals, etc. And then there is an issuer bank which takes care of the card issuance, interconnected using a scheme. So who are the new players in this overall NCMC ecosystem? The new players are the entire AFC ecosystem now connected to the payments ecosystem. So what are all the different components involved in this AFC ecosystem? The first component is the changes involved in printing an AFC acceptable payment cards. So there are changes involved in the overall card personalization process, and then there are terminals or kiosks which would be able to read and write data into the chips pertaining to those services, and then these terminals would work with the mechanical gates. Like for example, when we go to a metro, after reading a payment card, it should work with the physical gates to open and close the gates to work with the ecosystem. And the most important component here is the backend server, which works with the terminals and the mechanical gates and also interconnects with the acquirer banks for settlement and reconciliation purposes. So this entire AFC ecosystem is now connected to the banking ecosystem, and there are changes entailed in the card personalization process as well. So how does the data look like inside an NCMC compliant? We know that in a payment card, there will be standard EMV payment applications. For example, one chip card can contain a RuPay credit application, and it could contain a RuPay debit application, etc. So in addition to this applications, there is a new NCMC EMV application files that are present inside the card. So there is a common service area which consists of the wallet, that is the overall card balance that could be used in different metros or other locations, that is the closed loop wallet balance. And it also consists of the transactions, and most importantly, it holds the issuers and the operator keys. So this is a common service area. And then for each service that the customer subscribes to, there is a separate service area that would be written onto this chip. So what is a service? If the customer goes into a metro and wants the metro application inside the chip, it is a service. So let's assume that a customer subscribes to Bangalore's BMTC, then there is a separate service area that gets written to. So each of this is a separate service area, and it has data pertaining to that particular transit ecosystem, like the service ID, the product type, the validity dates, the daily limits, and the route details. And each of them have their own applications. So how does it look from an EMV perspective? If you're not comfortable with this, I would recommend you looking into the video that I had created for EMV file structure, the link to which will appear as I speak. So from an EMV perspective, there is a master file which consists of the RuPay debit or credit applications. And then there is a separate NCMC application definition file which consists of the issuer keys, the wallets, the transaction logs, and then there would be separate files for each service. So this entire new ADF would be created for NCMC. This is only an indicative EMV file structure. Just to explain that apart from the payment applications, we will also have NCMC data also present inside the chip. Now let's look at the changes involved in the card issuance process. The first scenario for a bank is to issue a non-NCMC card. This is the standard card issuance process where the card issuers work with the card production houses, and these cards are not NCMC usable, and these are pure payment cards only. The second scenario is where an issuer bank ties up with a specific service provider. Let's say a HDFC ties up with a Mumbai Metro to issue a HDFC Bank Mumbai Metro credit card. So in this case, the card issuers gather the service information and then provide the personalization data, which includes the payment card personalization data and also the service provider personalization data to the card production houses. So the card production houses now print the cards which are NCMC specific. That is, it contains of the persistent data which is for EMV applications, and it also contains the persistent data, that is, it creates the application definition files for the transit cards as well. So in this case, there is a default service area created for that specific service provider, and these cards can have additional services as and when the customer subscribe to additional services. So these type of cards are where the issuer banks work with a specific service provider and print NCMC compatible cards. The third scenario is where the issuer creates NCMC compatible cards and there are no specific services that are already embossed in the card, but the card holders can take those cards and then extend and add any number of services that they want as and then they subscribe to. So the issuers do not agree with any service providers, but they print NCMC supported cards and then provide it to the customers and let customers subscribe as and when they want. Now let's look at the overall AFC ecosystem in detail. The first entity is this validation terminal. So these validation terminals are very similar to that of our POS terminals. And these are embedded within the mechanical gates in a given metro. The purpose of this validation terminals is to quickly look at the NCMC application for that service and check if the card has enough balance to proceed with the travel, or if there is no balance, then reject that and then stop the customer from ongoing. So these validation terminals are very similar to POS terminals, but the purpose of these terminals is just to allow the customer to move on with that particular transit. These terminals have capability to read the balance, to write transactions into that NCMC application specific area, which is a closed loop area, and they do not necessarily work with the payment application data. So these terminals do not interact with the payment area, that is the RuPay, debit, credit, but it works with the NCMC specific areas only within an EMV chip. The next type of terminal is a kiosk, which has the capability to create services and to load money into that particular card. So these are kiosks where if the issuer has issued an NCMC compatible debit card, then the cardholders can take these cards to the kiosks and then newly add services to this. Let's say I have an NCMC compatible credit card. Now I want to add, Kanpur Metro into it. Then we take the card, put the card inside the kiosk. The kiosk will work with the issuer bank, and the kiosk will have the capability to add that service area inside that particular chip. And these terminals, the validation and the kiosk, work with the AFC backend server, which takes care of the fare management, the banking interface, the customer care, etc. And finally, this AFC backend server, the validation and the kiosk can directly interact with the acquirer bank to take the transactions to the issuer finally, because obviously the balance has to be debited or credited only after the issuer approves the transaction. So here the key thing here is the validation terminal can also directly talk to the acquirer bank, and the kiosk can also talk to the acquirer bank, but it is left to the software design as to how the overall communication is spread. It could be one hop away, that is the terminal can tap to the backend server and then to acquirer bank, or can directly interact with the acquirer bank. The same with kiosk as well. We will look at the flows, how money gets added onto the cards and how the transaction flows work in the next section. The first message that we are going to look is the service creation. What is a service creation? As I explained in the previous slide, the issuer has issued an NCMC compatible payment card. Now a customer walks and takes the card to, let's say, a new metro that has been launched into the city. Let's say it is Kanpur Metro. So the customer takes the card and puts it into a kiosk, where the kiosk has the capability to write new services into the EMV chip card. So in the kiosk, the customer will say, I want to add this new service and I want to load the card with 1,000 rupees. Then the AFC ecosystem, let's say in this case the kiosk, will create the message, which is an ISO 8583 message, and then pass it to the acquirer bank. And the acquirer bank passes the message to the issuer bank. So just to note here, all of these are standard ISO 8583 messages that gets created, and there are new processing codes that are created for service creation. And to note here, these work very similar to the payment ecosystem chip applications. That is, the standard RuPay's QSpark application has been used for this purpose as well. So when the issuer bank receives the service creation request, the issuer bank validates if the PIN is valid, and then the issuer bank provides an approval saying that yes, I'm happy to create a new service onto that particular card. And then basis the response that the issuer provides, the kiosk will now write the new service, which is the Kanpur Metro, into that particular chip. So to note here, the kiosk can create the new service area inside that particular chip only upon an approval from the issuer bank. There are standard EMV fields like IID. Basis this IID response only, the kiosk can write the additional service onto that particular chip. So this is the flow for creating a new service. This is a standard flow which we know, the acquirer bank to issuer bank via a scheme. But here the new terminals are these AFC terminals that would work with an acquirer bank. And unlike the standard POS terminals which the acquirer banks maintain, in this case the terminals are typically maintained by those respective transport authorities. The next message that we would look at is the money add message, where we want to load the transit card with certain amount. This works very similar to that of the service creation, where the customer enters the PIN and puts the card inside the kiosk, and the AFC ecosystem builds an 8583 message for an add money, and this is also a new type of ISO 8583 message with a new processing code which gets received by the issuer bank. The issuer bank processes this message, authenticates the cardholder, and then authorizes that yes, the money can be loaded onto the NCMC EMV area, and the AFC ecosystem, bases the IAD received in the response, will update the balance on the card. The next message is a debit transaction. So where we take an NCMC enabled card and then go on to a validation terminal. Typically these are the places where there's a mechanical gate. I just tap the card and the mechanical gate opens for us to go into the train station. So the moment we tap the card onto these validation terminals, what happens is the terminal validates if that service is present inside that particular chip and then debits the balance. So let's look at it a little bit more detail. So I have an NCMC card where I enabled the service for Bangalore Metro. So there is a separate service area and a service ID created for Bangalore Metro, and that is written onto the chip. So this Bangalore Metro's mechanical gates will recognize only the Bangalore Metro's chip application present. It will not recognize, let's say, a Delhi Metro. So what happens if I take a Bangalore Metro card, which is an NCMC card, and then go to a Delhi Metro? These gates won't open because it will not be able to find the corresponding Delhi Metro service inside that particular chip. So these type of validations are performed by the terminal, and if the service is present, it would check if the balance is present, and only if the balance is present, then it will allow. There are some specifics here where there is a transaction log maintained which tells when the customer entered an X location, where the customer is exiting a Y location. So there are certain computations performed by these terminals which I'm not going to go into detail, but all of this transaction information is written inside a chip. So these validation terminals are the ones which debit the balance on the card and write transaction logs. As you may guess, that this transaction messages are not directly sent immediately to the acquirer bank real time, because there would be a lot of real-time transactions that would be worked on, and we would not have time for the terminal to send an authorization message to acquirer bank and then receive a response, etc. So here the transaction happens offline, and the backend server batches all these transactions and sends this as a part of a settlement file to the acquirer, and the acquirer settles this transaction balance with the issuer bank here. So the key thing here is these are not real-time messages that are sent to the issuer bank, but these debit transactions are batched together and then sent as a settlement file for final settlement between the acquirer and the issuer bank. So these are the three important messages. We saw a service creation, we saw a money add function, and then we saw a debit transaction. Some final notes. So there are many parties involved in the entire development of NCMC. The first one is the card and the specification are owned by NPCI, and then the terminal specifications are by NPCI again, and then there is CDAC involved, and then there is Ministry of Urban Affairs also involved, and then the mechanical interface for the gates and terminals and all are developed by CDAC and the Central Ministry and then the BEL. The key thing to note here is all of these NCMC enabled cards are now RuPay, but Visa and MasterCard are also coming into the foray, and Visa has already developed specifications for NCMC, and MasterCard is also in the same race. So the same QSpark application, which is used for RuPay chip cards for payments, is extended to support the NCMC as well. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you learned something new about the overall new NCMC process. This is in a maturing state, and I'm sure we'll have more and more services added to this NCMC card. Thank you.